These two fixations shaped every moment of Henry VIII's rule. As his bloated body decayed from within during the final bitter winter of 1547, England's most infamous monarch faced death with the same cold calculation that had driven him to execute 2 wives and countless foes. Behind closed doors, courtiers whispered, "The lion is dying," yet they all knew his claws still drew blood. The road to this dreadful end began decades earlier with a prince admired across Europe for his athleticism, charm, and vitality. How did this radiant figure of the Renaissance become the grotesque tyrant gasping for air in the flickering candlelight of Whitehall Palace? The answer lies not only in his turbulent marriages, but in the relentless physical and psychological decline that ravaged him in his later years. By January 1547, Henry was a shadow of the man who had once dazzled at tournaments. His body was a ruin, his legs plagued by festering ulcers that stank so terribly that attendants struggled not to gag in his presence. He was so enormous that mechanical devices were needed to move him, and some claimed his weight had soared close to 400 pounds. The once handsome face had turned bloated and waxen, the eyes sunken deep into yellowing flesh. The royal physicians, powerless to stop the decay, resorted to bloodletting, herbal mixtures and prayer, all useless against the cascade of ailments destroying their sovereign. Modern scholars suspect Henry suffered from diabetes, gout, and possibly osteomyelitis, a severe bone infection that could explain the constant agony in his legs. But even more alarming than his physical deterioration was the collapse of his mind. His once formidable temper had transformed into fits of uncontrollable fury, alternating with spells of confusion and despair. Even as death loomed, the court buzzed with intrigue over who would control the realm once the king was gone. His third wife, Jane Seymour, had finally given him a son, young Edward, frail and only 9 years old, but rival factions already schemed for dominance. The conservative Catholic circle led by the Duke of Norfolk clashed with the reformist Protestants under Edward Seymour, the boy's uncle. Henry, ever suspicious, continued signing death warrants with trembling hands, determined to crush any perceived betrayal. The true state of the king's health was one of England's most tightly guarded secrets. Official proclamations still portrayed him as vigorous and commanding, but behind the palace walls the scene was grim. Visitors to his sick room found an atmosphere of decay, the air thick with incense trying and failing to mask the putrid odour, the vast royal bed draped in dark fabrics, and in the middle, the swollen, dying monarch who had once embodied English power. Servants whispered of hearing his screams echo through Whitehall's corridors as pain from his ulcers drove him to madness. Physicians tried every foul concoction they could imagine, ointments of boiled onions, animal fat, even powdered bone, none offering relief. Only heavy doses of opium eased his torment, dulling both his pain and his mind. The once mighty ruler was now trapped in a body that betrayed him. Witnesses described moments when he drifted between lucidity and delirium, muttering to the ghosts of executed enemies or calling out for his dead wives. When his mind cleared, he obsessed over his will, determined to dictate the course of England's future from beyond the grave. In those last days, he seemed haunted by the faith he had torn apart. After breaking from Rome to crown himself head of the Church of England, Henry now wrestled with gnawing doubts about his soul, an emperor at war with his body, his mind, and perhaps even his God. At the end, Henry's faith wavered as wildly as his health. One day he demanded the rights of the old Catholic Church, and the next he reaffirmed Protestant doctrines with equal conviction. His chaplain noted how the king would often wake in the night, trembling from nightmares, visions of Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, and other victims of his reign standing silently at the foot of his bed, their eyes fixed upon him in judgment. The shadow of his impending death unleashed chaos across the court. With the throne about to fall vacant, the Privy Council splintered into rival camps, each scrambling to secure influence over the young heir. Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, long a master of survival in Tudor politics, finally met his downfall. Outmaneuvered by the Protestant faction, he was condemned to death for treason, an order issued in the name of a dying king. Fate intervened, however. Henry perished before the sentence could be carried out, sparing Norfolk's life. The end began in earnest on January the 27th, 1547. Witnesses described a violent seizure that left Henry convulsing so fiercely that attendants were forced to restrain him. When it subsided, he was unable to speak properly, his right side paralysed, signs that today would be recognised as a massive stroke. Terrified of sharing their monarch's fate should he die under their care, the royal physicians resorted to desperate measures. They applied hot irons to his body, poured bitter tonics down his throat, and prayed for any sign of revival. Access to the royal chamber was tightly controlled by Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and one of the few men Henry still trusted. Cranmer's secrecy was not merely for dignity's sake. Any rumour of the king's death could spark an early coup or invite attack from abroad. Only essential attendants were allowed near the dying monarch, all sworn to silence. Even Queen Catherine, Parr, Henry's sixth and surviving wife, was kept away for much of those final grim hours. As January bled into February, Henry drifted between consciousness and delirium. During rare lucid moments, he seemed consumed by terror, not of political downfall, but of divine reckoning. The same man who had sent wives and nobles to the scaffold now whispered prayers for mercy. One servant recorded hearing the king murmur pleas for forgiveness in his sleep, a haunting reversal of the once defiant ruler who had defied the Pope and remade England in his image. Maintaining the illusion of royal dignity became an ordeal for those around him. As his body failed, teams of servants tended to him constantly, washing, dressing, and lifting the immense frame that had once commanded armies. His ulcerated legs had decayed so badly that bone was said to show through rotting flesh. The stench was unbearable. Courtiers clutched perfumed cloths to their faces and threw open windows despite the freezing air, just to breathe. By February 27th, the fiction of recovery had collapsed. The court knew the end was near. Archbishop Cranmer was summoned to his bedside as the king's breathing grew ragged and shallow. Unable to speak, Henry was asked to signal his faith. If he trusted in Christ rather than ceremony, he should squeeze Cranmer's hand. He did so, faintly, with what little strength remained. Protestants later celebrated this gesture as a final act of redemption. Before dawn on January 28, 1547, Henry VIII died. His colossal body lay still at last, a grotesque monument to power, ambition, and decay. The official record stated simply that the king had died of natural decay, but those who had witnessed his final days knew that nature had taken its revenge long before his last breath. Modern historians believe Henry's death was caused by a fatal combination of heart failure, blood poisoning from infected wounds, and complications related to what was likely type 2 diabetes. Yet even more remarkable than the king's death itself was the calculated silence that followed. For 3 full days, the Privy Council concealed the news while tightening its grip on power around the young heir, Edward VI. This delay allowed them to choreograph a seamless transfer of authority before England learned its king was gone. As Henry's corpse cooled in his chamber, Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford and uncle to the new boy king, moved swiftly and decisively. Behind closed doors, he convened secret councils, secured royal strongholds, and neutralised potential rivals. By the time the bells of London tolled on January 31st to announce Henry's passing, Seymour had already positioned himself as Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset, effectively the ruler of England in all but name. Handling the king's remains proved a grim ordeal, one that revealed much about both Tudor ritual and Henry's diseased body. Contemporary accounts describe the corpse decomposing at an alarming rate, likely due to the infections ravaging it at the time of death. The embalmers worked desperately, removing the internal organs and packing the hollowed torso with spices, herbs, and preservatives. Even these hardened professionals were reportedly appalled by what they found: a liver eaten away by disease and a heart grotesquely enlarged. The king's coffin had to be custom-built to contain his massive body, nearly twice the width of an ordinary noble's casket, and reinforced to bear the immense weight. During the lying in state at Whitehall, witnesses claimed the lead-lined coffin ruptured from the build-up of gases within the decaying corpse, causing foul fluids to seep onto the chapel floor. Though quickly veered up, rumours spread that dogs had lapped at the leakage, a ghastly and ironic fate for a man so obsessed with his royal dignity. When the funeral procession made its way to Windsor Castle on February 16, 1547, the Tudor court turned the occasion into one last spectacle of royal grandeur. Black-draped horses drew the enormous coffin through streets lined with mourners, while effigies showed the king as he had been in his prime, strong, imposing, and unbowed. At St. George's Chapel, Henry was buried beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who had borne him a son, and the only one spared disgrace by her untimely death. Beneath the surface, however, the truth of Henry's physical decay clashed sharply with the myth being crafted in his honour. Artists like Hans Holbein had immortalised him as the archetype of masculine power, broad-shouldered, commanding and unyielding, That image, polished and immortal, would endure for centuries, concealing the diseased, bloated body that lay beneath Windsor's stone floors. Henry's will offered a final glimpse into his enduring desire for control. Spanning over 30 pages, it meticulously outlined the order of succession, first his son Edward, then Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and finally Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's child. Though briefly disrupted by the 9-day rule of Lady Jane Grey, this succession unfolded almost exactly as Henry had decreed. In death, as in life, his will dominated England, guiding the realm through the reigns of all three of his children until the Tudor dynasty itself ended with Elizabeth I in 1603. For Edward's minority, Henry had designed a regency council of 16 men to govern collectively until the boy came of age. It was a deliberate attempt to prevent any single noble from monopolizing power, a final gesture from a king who had spent his life mastering, manipulating, and distrusting everyone around him. Despite Henry's elaborate plans to ensure a balanced regency, his political safeguards unravelled almost immediately. Within days of the king's death, Edward Seymour outflanked his fellow councillors and secured the title of Lord Protector, effectively taking sole control of the government. The swiftness with which Henry's intentions were overturned laid bare the limits of royal authority once the man himself and his terrifying presence were gone. Henry's final illness has continued to intrigue scholars and physicians for centuries. Theories about his condition have ranged from syphilis to scurvy, but the evidence most strongly supports a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes compounded by chronic osteomyelitis. His surviving medical records reveal increasingly desperate and gruesome treatments. Royal doctors applied live pigeons cut in half to his ulcerated legs, prescribed potions laced with gold dust and powdered gemstones, and experimented with alchemical mixtures that were more symbolic than medicinal. These futile remedies highlight both the ignorance of Tudor medicine and the extravagant extremes reserved for a monarch's suffering. After his death, a search of Henry's private chambers uncovered objects that offered a surprisingly human portrait of the man behind the crown. Amid the jewelled daggers, royal seals, and state papers was a small locked chest containing a miniature of Jane Seymour, a lock of his mother Elizabeth of York's hair, and a child's prayer book believed to have belonged to young Elizabeth before her mother's execution. These personal relics hint at an emotional core long buried beneath the image of tyranny, suggesting that even as his empire and body decayed, Henry clung to tokens of love and memory. Politically, the king's death sent immediate shockwaves through the realm. The conservative Catholic faction that had held influence during Henry's last year, ours was swiftly marginalised as Seymour's Protestant regency took control. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who had stood at the king's deathbed, now pushed ahead with reforms that Henry had only cautiously permitted. Within 2 years, the first Book of Common Prayer was published, marking a decisive move toward Protestant worship and cementing a religious transformation that Henry himself had never fully embraced. Henry's religious legacy remained deeply contradictory. He had severed ties with Rome, but kept many Catholic doctrines, leaving both sides of the faith divide to claim him. Protestants praised him as the monarch who broke papal power. Catholics pointed to his defence of the Mass and rejection of Lutheran ideas. This ambiguity would shape England's future for decades, driving the pendulum swings of faith under his 3 children, Edward's radical Protestantism, Mary's Catholic restoration, and Elizabeth's pragmatic middle path. The king's death also ushered in a new phase of Tudor propaganda. The image of Henry as England's mighty defender had to be carefully transferred to a frail 9-year-old boy. Court artists modelled young Edward VI's portraits after his father's famous stance, legs apart, hands on hips, exuding strength far beyond his years. Ceremonies reinforced the illusion of continuity, with courtiers required to bow to Edward's empty throne, just as they had to Henry's. Beyond the court, the king's passing left an emotional void throughout England. For nearly 40 years, Henry had dominated every aspect of national life. His moods and decrees had shaped policy, religion, and daily existence. Parish records from early 1547 reflect widespread unease. Reports of ominous dreams, strange lights in the sky, and ghostly apparitions multiplied across the countryside. To a deeply religious population, the death of so commanding a figure felt almost apocalyptic, the end of an age and the uncertain beginning of another. Abroad, news of Henry's death stirred both opportunity and caution among Europe's powers, revealing the delicate and precarious position England now occupied on the continental stage. Reports from across Europe captured the complex mix of respect, relief, and calculation that followed Henry's death. The French ambassador wrote that King Francis III sincerely mourned his brother of England, despite decades of rivalry and war. Emperor Charles V, nephew to Catherine of Aragon, viewed the event with pragmatic caution, pondering whether a kingdom ruled by a 9-year-old might be ripe for invasion or alliance. Even Pope Paul III, who had excommunicated Henry years earlier, ordered a mass for the king's soul, an act both conciliatory and symbolic, reaffirming Rome's claim over the fate of a monarch who had defied its authority. The very chamber in Whitehall Palace where Henry died quickly took on an air of dread. Courtiers whispered of chills, strange noises, and an oppressive heaviness that lingered long after the body was removed. Few dared to enter the rooms where he had suffered and raged in his final hours. Young Edward VI refused to sleep in his father's bed, insisting on new quarters. These superstitions reflected deeper psychological scars among those who had lived under Henry's volatile rule, now struggling to comprehend life without his dominating presence. From a medical standpoint, Henry's death remains one of the most thoroughly documented royal cases of the 16th century. His physicians, fearful of blame, kept meticulous notes of every treatment, ensuring posterity would see that no effort had been spared. These records reveal a striking blend of medieval and Renaissance practice. Galenic theories of humours still guiding bloodletting and cupping, herbal mixtures inspired by classical texts, and primitive hydrotherapies meant to balance the body's elements. Their failure underscores the limits of Tudor medicine, even at its most sophisticated. Henry's obsession with image extended beyond life itself. He had commissioned an enormous tomb intended to eclipse all royal monuments in England, 40 life-sized bronze figures, a vast central canopy, and an equestrian statue of himself presiding above. It was to be his ultimate statement of grandeur and divine kingship. Yet the project was never completed. Depleted finances stalled construction, and during the English Civil War, much of the bronze was melted down for cannon. The monument that was meant to immortalize him instead vanished, leaving only fragments of its design. In the power vacuum that followed his death, courtiers scrambled either to claim his legacy or distance themselves from it. Those once disgraced reappeared at court, while former favourites sought new patrons to ensure survival under Edward VI. Letters from servants reveal deep disorientation. Men and women who had built their lives around Henry's unpredictable moods suddenly found their skills useless in the calmer, more bureaucratic regency. Some, unable to adapt, took their own lives, casualties of a shifting world that no longer had a place for them. Most significantly, Henry's death signalled a structural change in English governance. The personal despotism that had defined his reign gave way to a more collective form of rule under the Lord Protector and the Privy Council. Edward Seymour, lacking his uncle's imposing authority, was forced to negotiate and compromise, setting early precedents for limits on royal power. Though temporarily reversed under Mary I, this shift planted the seeds of constitutional balance that would mature under Elizabeth I and later define the English monarchy itself. In the centuries since, physicians and historians have continued to revisit Henry's final illness, reinterpreting it through the lens of evolving science, from early speculations about syphilis to modern diagnoses of diabetes, obesity, and chronic infection. Each generation's conclusions say as much about its own understanding of disease as they do about the king, who, even in death, refused to be forgotten. Victorian physicians, guided by the moral frameworks of their time, often attributed Henry VIII's decline to syphilis, interpreting his suffering as divine punishment for a life of indulgence and excess. By the early 20th century, medical thinking had shifted toward physiological explanations. Experts proposed metabolic diseases such as gout and diabetes as the main causes of his ailments. Modern historians, drawing from a broader understanding of genetics and trauma, have offered more intricate diagnoses. Some point to McLeod syndrome, a rare genetic disorder explaining both his physical degeneration and erratic behavior, while others suggest chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the result of repeated head injuries sustained during his youthful jousting exploits. The fate of Henry's belongings after his death sheds light on Tudor attitudes toward mortality and memory. Royal inventories reveal how even mundane objects associated with the dying monarch were treated with reverence, almost relic-like, despite Protestant prohibitions against such veneration. His final nightclothes, soiled and symbolic, were ceremoniously burned under Archbishop Cranmer's supervision, an act balancing hygiene with ritual purification. More precious items, including his fine instruments for astronomy and navigation, were meticulously recorded and either distributed according to his will or reserved for the young King Edward's education. For those he left behind, Henry's passing brought both frows, Edom and peril. His widow, Catherine Parr, displayed the expected dignity of public mourning, yet wasted no time privately pursuing her long-suppressed affection for Thomas Seymour, whom she married within months. Edward, just 9 years old, ascended to the throne in name only, his will subsumed by the influence of his Seymour uncles. In his journal, the boy king recorded his father's death with striking coldness. The emperor's ambassador was commanded home on the 4th of January upon the death of the king my father, whose soul God pardon. The detached phrasing revealed a distant bond between father and son, perhaps emotional caution learned in a household ruled by fear. Henry's daughters faced equally delicate paths. Mary, now in her 30s, clung to her Catholic faith and quickly found herself estranged from Edward's Protestant regime. The adolescent Elizabeth had to tread carefully, her position made precarious by her mother's execution and her own questioned legitimacy. Both would ultimately claim their father's throne, but not without peril. Mary narrowly escaped death during Wyatt's rebellion, while Elizabeth endured imprisonment in the Tower during her sister's reign. Accounts of Henry's last hours capture the lonely finality that even the most powerful ruler cannot escape. Though attended by doctors, courtiers and clergy, witnesses described a monarch dying in near isolation, cut off from human connection by both his rank and the inevitability of death itself. Archbishop Cranmer's report that Henry's only response was a faint squeeze of the hand has become one of history's most poignant details. The man who had commanded an empire's obedience met the end powerless and alone, a reminder that kings, too, are subject to mortality's equalizing hand. In the months after his death, England began to reckon with the vacuum left by such a dominating figure, administress. Active logs show that even trivial matters had awaited his personal approval, evidence of a bureaucracy paralysed by royal micromanagement. Under Edward's regency, necessity forced reform, decisions were delegated, councils empowered, and systems modernised to function without constant royal interference. What began as disorder evolved into a more resilient form of government, one capable of enduring beyond the will of a single man. Henry's funeral provided the final act in his long performance of kingship. Chroniclers described a sombre pageant, horses draped in black velvet, heralds carrying his weapons of state, and a lifelike wax effigy dressed in coronation robes riding atop his coffin. The image of eternal majesty masked the reality beneath, the decaying body of a king who had ruled with unmatched grandeur, now rendered silent and still. The grand funeral procession that carried Henry VIII's body from London to Windsor stretched over several days, allowing thousands to witness the final spectacle of Tudor majesty. Every element of the ceremony was meticulously planned, reflecting both reverence and unease, a political performance meant to assure the realm that while the monarch had perished, the monarchy itself remained unbroken. For those closest to the king, particularly his physicians, the aftermath was fraught with uncertainty. Some of the court doctors, having failed to preserve their royal patient, sought safety by securing posts with noble households, while others suffered professional disgrace for their association with the unsuccessful treatment. Dr. Thomas Wendy, notable for his rare honesty in informing Henry of his approaching death when others hesitated, managed to transform that act of courage into continued royal service under Edward VI. The king's apothecaries were not so fortunate. The medicines administered during Henry's final illness were meticulously reviewed, with whispers of negligence or even intentional wrongdoing circulating in courtly gossip. Centuries later, the opening of H. Henry's tomb during renovations in the 19th century reignited fascination with his physical condition. Workers described discovering an enormous skeleton consistent with his imposing height, showing clear signs of joint decay, especially in the knees and ankles. Modern forensic analysis of historical evidence supports estimates that Henry's weight may have reached nearly 400 pounds, with a waist exceeding 50 inches. Combined with chronic leg ulcers and poor circulation, these conditions likely culminated in fatal sepsis. His vast frame, once a symbol of strength and virility, had become the instrument of his undoing. More than his ailments, however, Henry's final days revealed the boundaries of power itself. The man who had bent church and state to his will, who had commanded armies, and who had sent queens to their deaths, found himself powerless against the relentless decay of his own body. Witnesses recorded his furious outbursts, raging at physicians, demanding miraculous cures as if royal authority could overrule nature. In these moments, the illusion of absolute monarchy collapsed, exposing the frailty that no crown could conceal. In the spiritual sphere, Henry's death invited competing interpretations shaped by political agendas. Protestant writers portrayed him as finding enlightenment at the end, embracing their doctrines in his final moments. Catholic chroniclers, especially those abroad, depicted a tormented soul racked by remorse for defying the Pope. Yet evidence points to a more consistent picture. Henry remained true to his self-fashioned creed, Catholic in ritual and ceremony, Protestant only in rejecting papal supremacy. As in life, his theology served his personal authority above any doctrine. The economic consequences of his reign became painfully evident after his death. The Regency Council inherited a treasury on the brink of collapse, drained by Henry's wars, building projects, and personal extravagance. He had spent the equivalent of hundreds of millions in modern currency on palaces alone. To stabilise finances, Edward Seymour's government resorted to continuing Henry's sale of monastic lands, accelerating one of England's greatest property redistributions. The policy enriched a new class of landowners but also deepened economic instability, contributing to inflation and unrest that would plague the realm for decades. Contemporaries and later commentators alike saw in Henry's decaying body a dark reflection of his kingdom's condition. Tudor writers, steeped in the metaphor of the body politic, interpreted the king's physical corruption as symbolic of the moral and social decay afflicting England itself. The once mighty figure who had embodied the nation's strength now mirrored its weakness, a monarch whose body, like his empire, was grand, wounded, and nearing collapse. Surviving sermons from 1547 reveal how clergy transformed the king's suffering into moral allegory. Preachers drew vivid comparisons between Henry's festering legs and the supposed corruption of England's soul, suggesting that, just as his body had demanded surgical cleansing, so too did the nation require spiritual purification. Reformers under Edward VI seized on this imagery, presenting the young king's religious reforms as a necessary cure for the moral infection inherited from his father's reign. Henry's final days stand at a fascinating crossroads between two worlds, the medieval and the modern. The ornate death rituals surrounding him, the obsession with omens, relics, and succession anxieties echoed ancient traditions of kingship. Yet the meticulous documentation of his illness, the legal precision of his will, and the orderly transfer of authority reflected a distinctly new, bureaucratic understanding of power. Henry died as both the last monarch of the medieval order and the architect of England's emerging modern state. What makes his death particularly compelling is not only the political or medical drama that surrounded it, but its profound human dimension. The man who had ruled with terrifying confidence, who had reshaped religion and executed those who defied him, ultimately faced the same inescapable truth as every mortal. Accounts from those at his bedside suggest flashes of fear and remorse in his final hours, moments when the trappings of royalty fell away, leaving only a man confronting his own conscience. As Archbishop Cranmer reminded him while administering the last rites, Henry was about to stand before a power no crown could command, where neither titles nor armies could intercede. In that final reckoning, stripped of ceremony and authority, the most formidable king of England's age briefly shared the universal human experience he had so long seemed above, the quiet, solitary confrontation with death itself,